The flashing red and blue lights painted my front porch like a cheap disco. 2 patrol cars idled at my curb, and there she was. Karen, arms folded, lips curled in triumph, convinced she had finally cornered me. From her smug expression, you'd think she was about to host a parade in her own honor. I leaned against the railing, calm as a summer breeze, while she barked at the officers about illegal sheds and non-compliance with HOA governance. I almost laughed, except this was no HOA matter. This was Karen's latest tantrum, weaponized with a phone call. And then the sheriff arrived. Big man, wide brim hat, the kind who doesn't waste words. He scanned the scene, ignored Karen's shrill complaints, and turned straight to my wife. His back stiffened, his hand rose, and with one sharp motion he snapped a salute. Karen's face, pure shock. My wife simply nodded, calm, collected, like she'd been saluted 1,000 times before. And that's when I knew this story was about to get a whole lot better. Before I take you through the madness, drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to see how far this story travels. When my wife and I bought the place, we thought we'd finally scored our slice of peace. The house wasn't perfect, an older, country-style home with weathered siding, a porch that creaked like it was whispering secrets from 1962, and a patch of grass that hadn't seen a mower in at least a month. But it sat on a piece of land the HOA couldn't touch. That alone made it paradise in my book. Now let me explain something. If you've never had the pleasure of living near an HOA, you might think I'm exaggerating. But these folks, they treat grass like it's a religion, paint swatches like commandments, and mailboxes like holy relics. If your lawn is half an inch too tall, it's a mortal sin. If your shutters are a shade off from community-approved taupe, you might as well be branded a heretic. Our new place was technically in the neighborhood's orbit, but the official boundary line stopped short of our property, which meant in theory we were free. Free from dues, free from friendly reminders, free from Karens with clipboards. At least that's what I thought. The first week was bliss. My wife set up her little herb garden, and I started clearing the garage so I could finally build a workshop. We waved to passing neighbors, most waved back polite smiles, quick chats about the weather and where we'd moved from. I figured we'd blend in just fine. But then there was her. You could spot her before she even opened her mouth. Hair like it had been cemented in place, bright red blazer in 90-degree heat, and the ever-present clipboard. She strutted up the street like a queen patrolling her kingdom, peering at driveways, squinting at lawns, scribbling furious notes no one had asked for. When her eyes landed on us, it was like a hawk spotting a rabbit. I remember the first welcome. She stopped at the edge of our driveway, head-tilted eyes scanning every inch of the house like she was conducting a military inspection. "Oh, you're the new owners," she said, like we'd personally insulted her existence just by moving in. "Yes, ma'am," I answered, polite but wary. My wife gave a friendly smile. "We're just getting settled. It's a lovely neighborhood." Karen sniffed, clearly unconvinced. Then she held up a glossy folder with a logo on it, Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. Inside, I could see neatly stapled packets, forms, and what looked suspiciously like an invoice. "I've brought you the new resident packet," she said. "This covers dues, community standards, and the schedule for board meetings. You'll want to read it carefully." Now I knew enough to keep a straight face, but inside I was laughing. Dues, community standards. For us, our house wasn't even inside her jurisdiction. We were outside the HOA map, a free agent in enemy territory. Appreciate that I said taking the packet, but I don't think this applies to us. Our property isn't part of Pine Ridge HOA. The look on her face, oh, I'll never forget it. Like I'd just told her gravity didn't exist. She blinked, her lips pursed, and she actually stepped back as if the concept of non-HOA property was too much for her clipboard to handle. "Of course it applies," she snapped. "This entire community follows HOA regulations. It's mandatory. We can't have people, freelancing." My wife, calm as ever, reached into her pocket, pulled out a folded copy of our deed and handed it over. "Actually, our lot is excluded. The county records are clear. We're not bound by HOA covenants." Karen flipped through it like a teacher trying to catch a student in a lie. Her eyes darted, scanning the parcel numbers, the stamp seal, the notarized signature, and for one brief glorious second she faltered. "Well," she said, finally squaring her shoulders, "that doesn't mean you can ignore community standards. Property values are at stake." I smiled, leaned against the porch post, and said, "Don't worry, we'll keep our grass green enough not to tank the Dow Jones." My wife shot me a look, the one that said, "Stop poking the bear." But Karen didn't laugh. Not even a crack. She just glared, clutching that clipboard like it was her personal sword of justice. From that moment, I knew we were marked. The days that followed, we'd catch her circling like a shark. Sometimes she'd stand at the corner of our lot scribbling notes. Other times she'd stop neighbors mid-walk gesturing toward our house with wild hand motions. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. Her mouth was moving fast and her eyes burned holes in our siding. At night I joked with my wife. She probably has a file cabinet labeled with our names already. My wife would just smile, that patient smile, the one she used when she knew something I didn't. She wasn't rattled. If anything, she was waiting, watching, documenting. That's one of the first times I noticed how meticulous she was. She kept a little notebook tucked in the kitchen drawer. Every letter we received she date-stamped. Every odd encounter she jotted down. Photos of envelopes, recordings of conversations, even time-stamped screenshots of emails. At the time, I thought she was just being thorough. Later, I realized it was second nature, her training surfacing in everyday life. Meanwhile, I played the fool, acting like Karen's antics were just good comedy. But under the jokes, I felt it. The tension building. She wasn't done. People like Karen never are. And sure enough, before long, the petty notes and smug looks turned into something more. Something that would bring patrol cars to my curb and set the stage for the day. Karen would finally realize she'd picked the wrong neighbor. But I'm getting ahead of myself. At that point, all we knew was this Karen wasn't going to let us live quietly. And we weren't about to bow to her clipboard crown. It didn't take long for Karen to make her move. One Saturday morning, my wife and I were outside finally tackling the front yard. She was trimming the overgrown hedges while I was locked in combat with a lawnmower that seemed to resent me as much as Karen did. The thing sputtered, coughed, and stalled every 5 feet, but I was determined. Fresh start, fresh lawn. That's when I heard it, the sound of heels on pavement. Sharp, decisive clicks like a drum roll announcing trouble. I looked up, and there she was. Red blazer clipboard under her arm, marching toward us with the confidence of a 5-star general. "Good morning," she called out, her tone anything but friendly. "We need to discuss some concerns regarding your property." I killed the mower, wiped the sweat from my forehead, and forced a smile. "Morning, Karen. What can we do for you today?" Her eyes narrowed at my use of her name. She wanted President Morgan or Madam Chairwoman or whatever grand title she'd given herself. But she didn't correct me. Not yet. "First of all," she said, pulling a paper from her clipboard, "your lawn is already in violation. Pine Ridge HOA standards clearly state grass must be maintained at no more than 3 inches. You're over by at least half an inch." I blinked at her. "You measured my grass." "Yes," she replied, dead serious. "I carry a ruler for these situations." I couldn't help it, I laughed. Out loud. The kind of laugh that probably wasn't smart, but I couldn't stop. My wife, bless her, put down the trimmers and walked over calm as ever. "Ma'am," she said gently, as we explained before, "this property isn't part of the HOA. Your rules don't apply here." Karen's jaw tightened. She thrust the paper toward us. "Everyone in this neighborhood abides by the HOA. It's mandatory. If exceptions are made, property values plummet. We simply can't allow that." I leaned on the mower and said, "Don't worry. I'll trim it down to exactly 3 inches. Maybe even 2.9 if that'll help stabilize the housing market." My wife shot me a warning glance, her silent plea for me to stop poking the bear. But Karen wasn't letting go. "You think this is funny?" she snapped. "These standards exist for a reason. Uniformity keeps our community safe, respectable, and desirable. Without them, we descend into chaos. Chaos. Over a lawn. I swear, if irony had a face, it would have been smiling right behind her that morning. My wife, ever the professional, held her ground without raising her voice. "We're happy to keep our property neat. But as for HOA rules, we're not bound by them. The county plat is clear." Karen's eyes darted between us, frustration, mounting. She wasn't used to resistance. Most people probably folded the moment she showed up with that clipboard. But not us. "You'll regret this," she hissed finally. "The board will hear about it." I almost asked her if the board met in a secret underground lair with matching robes and a ceremonial lawnmower, but I bit my tongue. Barely. She turned on her heel and marched back down the sidewalk, heels clicking like gunfire. As she disappeared around the corner, I muttered, "Well, that was fun." My wife didn't laugh. She just sighed. This isn't over. And she was right. Over the next week, Karen made her presence known. One afternoon, I came home to find a neon yellow notice taped to our door, "HOA warning, non-compliant mailbox." Our mailbox was black, sturdy, and functional. Apparently it didn't meet the approved rustic bronze standard. I ripped the notice down and tossed it into the trash. The next day, another notice, "HOA warning, unapproved pet activity." Our dog Max had barked at her while she walked by. That was apparently grounds for review. And then came the piece de resistance, "HOA warning, illegal vehicle storage." That one was about my pickup truck, which I parked legally on my own driveway. According to Karen, pickups lowered the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. Each notice went straight into the growing file my wife kept in her drawer. She never ranted, never snapped. She just documented. Dates, photos, copies, calm efficient like she was quietly preparing for a case. I, on the other hand, grumbled, cracked jokes, and dreamed of buying a giant neon sign that said, "Not your HOA." But my wife's approach was better. She knew something I didn't, that patience would pay off. The first real showdown came a few days later. I was in the garage sorting tools when Karen marched up again. This time she had reinforcements, 2 men in polo shirts with HOA badges clipped to their belts. They looked like security guards from a shopping mall, but the way they puffed their chests, you'd think they were storming Normandy. Mr. Taylor Karen began clipboard at the ready. "This is your final warning. If you refuse to comply with HOA standards, we will pursue legal action." I wiped my hands on a rag and leaned against the workbench. "Karen, you can send me all the letters you want. But unless you've rewritten county law, you've got no power here." One of the polo shirt enforcers stepped forward. "Sir, it would be wise to cooperate." That was it. The moment when the comedy stopped being funny. My wife, who'd been standing quietly at the door, finally stepped forward. Her voice was low even, but it carried weight. "You're trespassing. This is private property. I suggest you leave before this escalates further." For the first time, I saw Karen hesitate. Her eyes flicked to my wife, and something about the way my wife stood calm, firm, unshaken, made her falter. But she recovered quickly. "You'll be hearing from us," she spat, retreating down the driveway with her entourage in tow. I exhaled, shaking my head. Well, that was dramatic. My wife closed the garage door and looked me straight in the eye. "This is just the beginning." She was right. Because Karen wasn't done, and soon her obsession with control would push her to do something reckless, something that would bring flashing lights to our street and a sheriff's salute that would turn the entire neighborhood upside down. If there's one thing I've learned about people like Karen, it's this: they never quit after losing round one. If anything, resistance makes them hungrier, like sharks, only with clipboards and bad attitudes. After the final warning fiasco in my garage, I half hoped she'd simmer down, maybe move on to policing someone else's flower beds. But Karen wasn't built for letting go. Oh no, she doubled down. It started with the mailbox. Again, one morning I walked out to grab the newspaper and found an envelope tucked under the flag. Inside was a letterhead stamped with Pine Ridge HOA board in bold. The letter accused us of repeated violations of mailbox standards and threatened fines of $150 for each day we failed to comply. I chuckled and waved it at my wife. "Guess I'm going to prison over a mailbox." She didn't laugh. She took the letter, slipped it into her growing evidence file, and said quietly, "Keep every single one." By the end of that week, we'd received 3 more. All nearly identical, all threatening escalating fines. None of them legally enforceable, but annoying as hell. Then came the community survey. A stack of photocopied papers appeared in our mailbox, ironically delivered by the very HOA that insisted we weren't members. Each page had questions like, "Do you feel the Taylor's property negatively impacts your quality of life? Should Pine Ridge HOA be granted authority to enforce standards outside current borders? How important is uniformity of sheds, fences, and lawn ornaments to you personally?" I nearly spit my coffee when I read that last one. Lawn ornaments. I pictured a courtroom scene where a judge banged the gavel and declared, "Sir, your gnome is out of compliance." But beneath the humor, it grated on me. Karen wasn't just pestering us. She was trying to rally the neighborhood against us. Sure enough, whispers started. A neighbor 2 houses down, Mr. Caldwell, stopped me while I was unloading groceries. "You know the board's been saying your shed's lowering property values. People are worried." I bit back a laugh. "The shed isn't even built yet." "Yeah, well," he trailed off, shifting uncomfortably. "Just saying. They're talking." That was Karen's specialty, planting seeds of doubt. If she couldn't control us, she'd make us look like the villains. But the real escalation came with our dog Max. One evening, I let him out into the yard. He barked like dogs do when a rabbit darted across the grass. Next morning, taped to our door, HOA infraction notice: dangerous animal on premises. Dangerous animal Max was a 70-pound mutt who got scared of vacuum cleaners. I pictured him standing trial in tiny paw cuffs. My wife didn't smile at my jokes this time. She read the notice carefully, snapped a photo, and filed it away. "This is harassment," she said flatly. And she was right. Karen wasn't just bluffing anymore, she was escalating into character assassination. One Friday, I came home from work to find my driveway blocked. Parked right in front of it was Karen's SUV hazard lights blinking like she owned the street. She stood beside it, arms crossed, clipboard clutched like a holy relic. "You need to stop this nonsense," she announced before I could even open my truck door. "The board will not tolerate freeloaders destroying our standards." I stepped out slowly, set my briefcase on the hood, and said, "Karen, you're trespassing. Move your car." She sneered. "Or what you'll call the cops. Go ahead. I already have them on speed dial." And that's when it clicked she wasn't bluffing. She wanted a showdown. My wife appeared at the front door, arms folded, calm but watchful. She didn't say a word, just observed. That quiet composure seemed to unsettle Karen more than my sarcasm ever could. Finally, after a tense standoff, Karen yanked her keys from her purse and drove off in a huff. But the damage was done. The line had been crossed. That night at dinner I ranted, "She's insane. Blocking our driveway, filing bogus notices, what's next, calling animal control on Max for wagging his tail too hard." My wife didn't rise to the bait. She just tapped her file, the thick stack of letters, notices, and photos she'd been collecting. Let her keep going. The more she pushes, the stronger our case becomes. I shook my head, baffled by her patience. "You sound like you've done this before." She smiled faintly but didn't answer. Instead, she poured me another glass of wine and changed the subject. But her eyes told me she was already 3 steps ahead. Things came to a head the next week. I was halfway through framing the shed when I heard shouting. Karen had gathered 2 board members and was pointing furiously at the half-built structure. "This is unacceptable," she bellowed, waving her clipboard like a sword. "You can't just build whatever you want. It violates our uniformity guidelines." I wiped the sawdust from my hands and walked over. "Karen, this isn't your property. Your guidelines don't apply here." She jabbed a finger at me. "We'll see about that. I'm calling the police." One of the board members looked uneasy. "Karen, maybe—" "Silence," she snapped. "This is my community and I will protect it." She stormed off, phone in hand, barking into it as she marched down the street. I glanced at my wife. She was standing by the porch, arms crossed, watching calmly. She didn't look worried. If anything, she looked prepared. "Here we go," I muttered. And sure enough, the following afternoon, the flashing lights rolled down our street. Patrol cars parked at our curb. Karen strutted behind them, smug as a cat bringing home a dead mouse. The war had officially escalated, and I had no idea just how spectacularly it was about to backfire. By the time spring rolled into summer, the HOA's obsession with our property had turned from nuisance into circus. And like any circus, it needed a ringmaster. Enter Karen, blazer-pressed clipboard, loaded voice sharpened to a blade. I had been building my workshop shed for weeks, framing the walls and setting the roof beams. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Every swing of the hammer felt like reclaiming space, like planting a flag that screamed, "This is my land." Karen, of course, saw it differently. That Saturday morning, as I balanced on a ladder, hammer in hand, I heard the inevitable click of heels on pavement. I didn't even need to look. My wife, who was weeding the herb garden, murmured, "Incoming." Karen arrived with a storm cloud expression, and to my surprise, reinforcements again. 2 men in pressed polos, the kind of volunteers who mistake an HOA badge for a police shield. One carried a tape measure, the other a camcorder. Mr. Taylor, Karen barked as though I'd been called to stand trial. "Cease construction immediately. This structure is in blatant violation of HOA standards." I climbed down slowly, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Karen, for the last time, this shed is not under your jurisdiction. It's approved by the county. End of story." She slapped a sheet of paper onto her clipboard. "Not end of story. Section 4B clearly states all auxiliary structures must conform to community aesthetic." I glanced at the paper. It wasn't even addressed to us. Wrong parcel number, wrong block. She might as well have handed me a takeout menu. "Nice paperwork," I said, smirking. "Can I get fries with that?" Karen's eyes flashed fire. She turned to her polo shirt deputies. "Measure it. Film everything. This will go on record." The man with the tape measure stepped onto my lawn. My wife's voice rang out sharp and clear. "Stop. You're trespassing." The man froze mid-step, glancing nervously at Karen. My wife walked forward, calm but firm, pointing to the property line markers embedded in the ground. "This is private property. Step back." Karen scoffed. "Don't try to intimidate us. The board has every right to inspect—" "No, you don't," my wife interrupted. Her tone wasn't loud, but it was commanding, the kind of tone that makes even stubborn people hesitate. "Leave. Now." I'd seen my wife like this before, not often, but enough to know she wasn't bluffing. It was the kind of calm that made people reconsider their choices. Karen, however, wasn't most people. She squared her shoulders, face reddening. You think you're above the rules. You think you can just laugh at this community. We'll see what the police have to say about that. I crossed my arms, unimpressed. By all means, call them. Maybe they'll measure my grass while they're at it. Karen let out a frustrated scream, a sound somewhere between a kettle boiling and a banshee shriek. She stomped back down the driveway, barking into her phone as if she were calling in an airstrike. Here deputies scrambled after her camcorder still rolling. My wife and I exchanged a look. She didn't look scared. She looked ready. This won't end well for her, she said softly, almost to herself. Then she turned back to the garden as if nothing had happened. That evening, while I grilled burgers on the back patio, I couldn't shake the feeling of storm clouds gathering. It wasn't fear, more like the sense that Karen was about to escalate to her final weapon. Sure enough, around 7:00 p.m., a neighbor swung by to warn us. Hey, just so you know, Mr. Caldwell said awkwardly, Karen told the board. She's calling the cops on you. Said she's reporting you for illegal construction. I sighed, flipping a burger. Figures. She's telling folks you're dangerous, he added nervously. That you threatened her. I laughed out loud. Threatened her, I asked if I could get fries with her fake paperwork. Caldwell shrugged helplessly. I'm just telling you what she's spreading. After he left, my wife joined me on the patio. She wasn't rattled. She was writing in her notebook again, recording the day's events. Why do I feel like you're running a case file, I teased. She smiled faintly but didn't answer. Instead, she slid the notebook shut and said, Be ready tomorrow. I frowned. For what? The escalation, she replied simply, and she was right. The next day, I was inside working on some shelving when Max started barking. Not his usual playful bark, this was sharp, urgent. I stepped outside to see 2 patrol cars slowly pulling up to our curb. Their lights weren't flashing, but the message was clear. Karen had made her move. And there she was, strutting behind them, clipboard clutched, tight smirk plastered across her face like she'd just won the lottery. Neighbors peeked from porches, phones in hand, waiting for the drama. I wiped my hands on a rag, calm as I could manage, but inside, my blood boiled. Karen had crossed the line from nuisance into outright abuse of authority. As the officers stepped out, Karen launched into her performance. Officers, thank you for coming so quickly. This man is building an illegal structure, endangering property values and refusing to comply with community regulations. He's hostile and has threatened me in the past. I almost choked. Threatened her. The only thing I'd threatened was the sanctity of her clipboard. The officers looked at me expectantly. One raised an eyebrow, clearly trying to make sense of the chaos. Before I could respond, my wife stepped forward, calm, controlled, like she'd been waiting for this moment all along. This property is outside HOA jurisdiction, she explained evenly. We are in full compliance with county code. I have documentation. She gestured toward the file she kept near the porch, already prepared. Karen flailed her clipboard. Don't listen to her, she's twisting the rules. They think they're above the law. The officers exchanged a look. One of them muttered, We should probably get a supervisor. Karen didn't notice. She was too busy basking in what she thought was her victory. But she had no idea the storm she'd just invited to her doorstep. Because when that supervisor showed up, he wouldn't just settle the matter. He'd salute my wife. And that salute would change everything. When the patrol cars parked in front of our house, the entire street turned into a live audience. Curtains twitched, blinds parted, neighbors leaned on fences, with phones angled just right to record. HOA drama was their Super Bowl, and Karen had just called the kickoff. I stood on the porch, hands resting on the railing, projecting calm I didn't quite feel. My wife was beside me, arms folded, gaze steady. She looked like she'd seen this scene play out 100 times before. I, on the other hand, was trying not to laugh at the absurdity of being treated like a criminal over a half-built shed. Karen strutted up to the officers, her voice pitched high enough for the entire block to hear. Thank you for responding so quickly. This man is constructing an illegal building in violation of community standards. He's refused multiple warnings and has shown hostility toward the HOA. One officer, a tall guy with tired eyes, glanced at me, then back at her. Ma'am, is this structure on his property? Karen hesitated only for a second, but it was enough. Property lines are complicated, she snapped. The board has jurisdiction. It's all documented. Documented by who? I called out, unable to resist. Your clipboard, or the county registrar. A few neighbors chuckled. Karen's glare could have melted concrete. The second officer approached me. Sir, can you explain what you're building here? I gestured toward the frame of my shed. A workshop, county approved, permits pulled, zero connection to the HOA. They have no authority here. My wife handed over a neatly organized folder she'd prepared in advance: permits, property maps, deed copies. The officer flipped through, nodding slightly. Meanwhile, Karen was still in performance mode. She waved her arms dramatically. "Don't be fooled. They've been aggressive. Their dog is dangerous. And look at this." She pointed to the shed like it was a meth lab. "It's an eyesore. It violates community aesthetics." The first officer sighed. "Ma'am, HOA rules don't override county property lines. If it's not in your jurisdiction, there's not much we can do." Karen's voice rose. "Not much you can do. This community is at risk. Property values are collapsing. Look around you. Chaos is taking over." I couldn't resist. "Chaos, Karen. It's a shed, not the fall of Rome." Laughter rippled through the gathering crowd. Karen's face flushed crimson, but she wasn't done. She pulled out her phone, dialing furiously. "Fine. If you won't act, I'll call the sheriff directly. He'll take this seriously." That made the officers exchange a look. One muttered, "She's actually calling him." I raised an eyebrow. Well, this should be interesting. 10 minutes later, the low rumble of a larger vehicle echoed down the street. A white SUV with the county sheriff's insignia, rolled up headlights cutting through the late afternoon Sunday. The crowd hushed. Even Karen straightened her blazer like a general awaiting reinforcements. The sheriff stepped out tall, broad-shouldered, his hat pulled low. His presence alone silenced the chatter. Karen marched toward him like she'd just summoned her personal knight. "Sheriff," she exclaimed, pointing furiously at me. "Thank goodness you're here. This man is building illegally, refusing compliance, and endangering our community. You need to shut this down immediately." The sheriff didn't even look at me, not at first. His eyes scanned the shed, then the gathered neighbors, then finally he turned his gaze toward my wife. And that's when everything shifted. His posture straightened, his jaw set, and with one crisp, deliberate motion, he lifted his hand to his brow and saluted. The crowd gasped. Karen's triumphant expression faltered, confusion flickering across her face. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, his tone respectful. My wife nodded, once calm as ever, returning his gaze without flinching. "Sheriff." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Neighbors whispered, phones zoomed in, Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. I leaned on the porch railing, savoring the moment. Well, this just got interesting. The sheriff finally turned his attention to the officers. "I'll take it from here." They nodded quickly, stepping back. Karen regained her voice, though it cracked with desperation. "Sheriff, you don't understand. They're destroying property values. They're violating standards. You can't just ignore this." The sheriff gave her a look that could cut steel. "Ma'am, I understand more than you realize. Now step aside." Karen froze, caught between outrage and fear. She stepped back, clutching her clipboard like a life raft. The sheriff approached us calmly. "Everything all right here?" My wife replied simply, "All under control. Thank you for coming." The respect in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just about a shed anymore. My wife had a history with him, professional, serious, something Karen couldn't begin to comprehend. And from the look on her face, that realization was hitting her harder than any HOA fine ever could. For the first time since we'd moved in, the power dynamic had shifted. The crowd wasn't looking at Karen anymore. They were looking at my wife with respect, curiosity, even awe. Karen's kingdom of clipboards had just been reduced to rubble, and she knew it. But the best part, the real reveal, hadn't even happened yet. Because soon everyone would learn why the sheriff saluted my wife. And once that truth came out, there'd be no going back. When the sheriff's salute cut through the air, it was like someone had slammed the pause button on the entire street. Even the birds stopped chirping. The neighbors froze mid-swipe on their phones. Karen's smirk dissolved into slack-jawed confusion. And my wife, she didn't flinch. She simply nodded back at him, calm, professional, as though this was just another Tuesday in her world. "Ma'am," the sheriff said again, his voice steady, respectful. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Karen. His attention was locked solely on my wife. Karen sputtered, trying to regain control. "Sheriff, what are you doing? Why are you saluting her? I called you here to enforce the rules. She's the one breaking them." The sheriff's eyes slid toward Karen, and I swear I saw the faintest twitch of irritation cross his face. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "you'd better lower your voice." Karen blinked, taken aback. She wasn't used to being told no, especially not in front of an audience. She jabbed her clipboard toward us like it was Excalibur. "They're building illegally. They're refusing HOA compliance. This is a threat to our community." The sheriff turned to my wife again. "Is everything all right here?" "Yes," my wife replied simply. "We're in compliance with county code. The shed is permitted. The harassment is not." The sheriff gave a single nod like that answer was all he needed. The crowd, meanwhile, was buzzing. You could hear whispers travel like wildfire. Why did he salute her? Does he know her? Who is she? Phones tilted higher, recording every angle. Karen, realizing the shift in the narrative, grew desperate. She stomped her heel against the pavement like a petulant child. No, this isn't how it works. You can't just take their word for it. She's manipulating you. They're outsiders. They think they're above the law. I leaned casually against the porch railing. Karen, I hate to break it to you, but the law doesn't live inside your clipboard. A ripple of laughter broke out among the neighbors. Even one of the officers, hiding a grin, turned away quickly. Karen's face turned a shade of red, usually reserved for fire hydrants. The sheriff, unshaken, addressed the officers. Stand down. This is not an HOA matter, and it's certainly not criminal. Karen gasped, like he'd stabbed her through the heart. Not an HOA matter, Sheriff, with all due respect. I'm the president of Pine Ridge Homeowners Association, and I demand you enforce our standards. The sheriff's gaze sharpened. With all due respect, ma'am, your standards don't extend past your own jurisdiction, and this property isn't in it, which means your demands don't hold up here. The silence that followed was delicious. The kind of silence that lets truth sink in so deep it leaves bruises. Karen stammered, But property values. The sheriff cut her off. Enough. It was in that moment, standing in front of my house, that I finally saw Karen crack. She wasn't a queen commanding subjects anymore. She was a flailing dictator whose subjects had realized the crown was made of cardboard. The sheriff turned to my wife once more, his tone respectful. Would you like me to file a report on this incident? Yes, she said firmly. Document everything. False reports, harassment, trespassing attempts. Karen's head whipped toward her. False reports. How dare you? Ma'am, the sheriff said again, steel in his tone. One more outburst and you'll be the one explaining yourself downtown. The crowd murmured in delight. For once, Karen was on the defensive, and everyone was savoring it. I couldn't resist twisting the knife, just a little. Hey Karen, I called out loud enough for the whole street. You might want to measure your own lawn. Looks like your grass is at least 4 inches. Laughter erupted. Phones caught every second. Karen's hands trembled around her clipboard. For the first time since we'd moved in, she didn't have a comeback. She turned on her heel, muttering something under her breath, and stalked off toward her SUV. The 2 polo shirt board members who had followed her earlier lingered awkwardly, clearly unwilling to follow her into battle anymore. They avoided eye contact and drifted back into the crowd. As the sheriff finished exchanging a few quiet words with my wife, I stood there trying to piece it together. His salute, his respect, the way he deferred to her, this wasn't neighborly familiarity. This was professional. When the sheriff finally tipped his hat and walked back to his SUV, I asked the question burning on my tongue. Honey, what exactly was that? She gave me that calm smile, the one that hid more than it revealed. Just someone recognizing a colleague. I blinked. A colleague. What kind of colleague gets saluted by the county sheriff? Her smile widened, but she didn't elaborate. You'll see. And just like that, she walked back inside, leaving me on the porch with my jaw half open and the entire neighborhood buzzing like a beehive. The whispers turned into speculation. Neighbors huddled in small groups, piecing together theories. She must be military. No federal. FBI, maybe. Whatever she is, Karen's finished. Karen, meanwhile, sat in her SUV, white-knuckling the steering wheel, refusing to drive away until the sheriff's vehicle pulled out first. Her face was frozen in a mask of humiliation, a woman who had just realized her kingdom was built on sand, and for once the power wasn't hers. The board's paper tigers had roared, and my wife had answered without raising her voice. But this was only the beginning, because soon the full truth about who she really was would come out and Karen's entire empire of intimidation would come crashing down. If Karen thought she could recover from the sheriff's salute, she was about to learn otherwise. That single gesture had already cracked her armor. But the reveal, the real reveal, was the sledgehammer that would finish the job. The sheriff lingered a little longer than I expected, flipping through my wife's folder of documents. He didn't rush, didn't fumble. He read with the patience of someone used to sifting through evidence. Finally, he closed the file, handed it back with a respectful nod, and said, "You've done this exactly by the book." Karen, who had inched closer to eavesdrop, practically shrieked. "By the book? By what book? She's twisting the law. Don't you see? This is manipulation. You're all being fooled." The sheriff turned to face her, fully voice measured. "Ma'am, you do well to watch your accusations. You're speaking to a federal agent." The gasp that tore through the crowd was louder than any thunderclap. I swear, even Max, my dog, stopped mid-bark and tilted his head. Karen blinked like she'd been slapped. "Eh? What?" Federal agent, the sheriff, repeated his tone, leaving no room for doubt. "Her credentials are current. Her authority is legitimate. And you've wasted law enforcement resources, harassing her over property you have no jurisdiction over." The neighborhood erupted. Some neighbors whispered frantically, others outright laughed. Phones whipped back up, capturing every second of Karen's unraveling. Karen shook her head violently like she could fling the words out of her ears. "No, no, this is insane. She's lying, she's faking it. Anyone can print a badge." My wife, calm as stone, opened her wallet. With deliberate precision, she revealed her federal ID. Not flashed, not waved around, presented. Professional, official, undeniable. The sheriff nodded at it once more. Verified. Karen's knees almost buckled. Now, if this were a courtroom drama, the judge would have pounded a gavel and shouted, "Case dismissed." But this was better. This was public humiliation served fresh on the suburban stage. One neighbor whispered too loudly, "Karen's been harassing a federal agent this whole time." Another chuckled. "She's finished. Absolutely finished." Karen, red-faced and trembling, tried one last desperate lunge for control. You can't let her intimidate us. She's abusing her power. This is corruption." The sheriff's patience finally snapped. His voice boomed, silencing the street. "Enough. Do you realize the severity of filing false reports against a federal agent? Do you understand the criminal liability you've created for yourself and your board?" Karen's clipboard slipped in her sweaty grip. For once, she had no script, no citation, no HOA clause to hide behind. My wife's voice was quiet, but it carried like a hammer. "I've documented every notice, every trespass, every false claim. If you continue, Karen, this won't be an HOA squabble. It'll be federal." The word federal hung in the air like a guillotine blade. The neighbors erupted again, some clapping, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The two board members who had tagged along earlier suddenly found urgent reasons to be anywhere else. They slipped away into the crowd, abandoning Karen like rats from a sinking ship. Karen's voice cracked as she tried to salvage herself. But property values? I couldn't resist. I spread my arms wide and called out, "Don't worry, Karen. Having a federal agent on the block probably raised the values. You're welcome." The crowd laughed, even the sheriff cracked the faintest smile. Karen, however, looked like she might explode. She stomped her heel, screamed, "This isn't over," and stormed toward her SUV. But the sheriff wasn't done. "Ma'am," he called, his voice like iron. She froze mid-step. "If you continue this behavior, harassment, false reporting, trespassing, you will be arrested. Consider this your only warning." Karen didn't reply. She yanked open her SUV door, threw her clipboard inside, and peeled off down the street, tires squealing like a tantrum on wheels. When the dust settled, the neighborhood felt different. Lighter somehow. Like a spell had been broken. People who had kept quiet out of fear of Karen's wrath were suddenly chatting, laughing, even applauding. About time someone stood up to her, Mr. Caldwell muttered, shaking his head. "Guess it took a federal agent to do it." I turned to my wife, still reeling. "So let me get this straight. You're not just meticulous. You're not just calm under pressure. You're—" She gave me that same faint smile she always did when she knew something I didn't. "Federal agent, yes. I didn't think it was relevant to mention until now." "Not relevant," I nearly laughed. "Honey, you've been saluted by a sheriff in front of the entire neighborhood. I'd say that's relevant." She shrugged as if she'd just admitted she was good at crossword puzzles. "It's just a job." I shook my head, marveling. A job that just sent Karen running for the hills. That night, the neighborhood group chat was on fire. Screenshots, videos, and memes of Karen's meltdown flooded every phone. One particularly creative neighbor made a gif of the sheriff saluting my wife while Karen's face turned redder than her blazer. For once, the HOA president wasn't feared. She was ridiculed. And my wife, she didn't bask in it, didn't brag, didn't gloat. She just sat on the porch with me, sipping her tea-file folder neatly stacked at her side. "You realize you just ended her little empire, right?" I said. She glanced at me, eyes steady. "Bullies fall when the truth shows up. That's all this was." I leaned back, smiling. "Yeah, but admit it, it was one hell of a show. If you thought Karen would take her humiliation quietly, you don't know Karens." The very next morning, while the neighborhood was still buzzing about the sheriff's salute, she was back on the warpath. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, like she was some kind of celebrity avoiding paparazzi. Except this time, she wasn't strutting. She was flailing. She marched from door to door, pounding on neighbors' houses, thrusting flyers into their hands. From my porch, I could hear her voice shaky, shrill, insisting that federal intimidation was at play, that the HOA was under attack, and that property values were in grave danger. Some neighbors took the flyers politely and tossed them into the nearest trash can the moment she turned her back. Others shut the door in her face before she could finish her rant. By noon, she had only a handful of loyalists left, mostly the type who complain about kids riding bikes too close to their driveways. The rest of the neighborhood, they were done. But Karen wasn't finished. She decided to stage a public spectacle. Around 3 o'clock, she parked her SUV in the cul-de-sac and set up what she clearly thought was a press conference. A folding table appeared covered with stacks of papers, stamped letters, and a little battery-powered megaphone. "Attention Pine Ridge residents," she screeched into the mic, her voice cracking with desperation. "We are at a turning point in our community. Our values, our safety, and our dignity are under siege." I leaned against my fence, sipping iced tea, watching with amusement. My wife, as usual, didn't react, just jotted notes into her file like she was recording evidence for later. Karen's conference quickly devolved into a one-woman meltdown. She waved papers in the air like a prophet clutching commandments, declaring that our shed was a monstrosity, that our dog was a vicious threat, and that our refusal to pay dues was tantamount to theft. "Theft," she shrieked. "They're stealing from you, from your families, from your futures." One neighbor shouted back, "Karen, they don't even live in the HOA." The crowd chuckled. Phones filmed. Karen's face twisted in rage. That's when she turned her fury directly on us. She pointed her megaphone toward our porch, voice shaking. "You think you're above the rules. You think you can humiliate me in front of this entire community. But this isn't over. We will crush this rebellion." The phrasing rebellion nearly made me spit my tea. My wife raised an eyebrow, murmuring interesting choice of words. I couldn't resist. I cupped my hands and shouted back, "Long live the rebellion." The crowd erupted in laughter. Karen's hands trembled as she slammed the megaphone onto the table. She tried to regain composure, pulling out what looked like a thick binder of evidence. She held it up dramatically. "I have documented every violation, every insult, every act of aggression, and I will take this to the highest authorities." My wife's calm voice cut through the noise. "Good, so will I." The crowd went quiet. Everyone knew she wasn't bluffing. Karen's face drained of color. For a moment I thought she might faint. Instead, she slammed the binder shut, grabbed her megaphone, and barked, "This meeting is adjourned," before storming back to her SUV. Later that evening, a memo slipped under our door, typed in all caps, stamped with the HOA logo, and signed, of course, by Karen. It read, "Notice of community censure. The Taylors are hereby censured by Pine Ridge HOA for acts of hostility, defiance, and federal overreach. They are declared enemies of community harmony." I nearly fell over laughing. Enemies of community harmony. It sounded like a bad rock band name. But my wife didn't laugh. She simply added the memo to her file. "Every piece matters," she said calmly. The next day, the sheriff himself returned, not because of Karen's antics, but to follow up with my wife. They spoke quietly at the porch, his tone respectful. When he left, he gave me a nod. "Stay patient. Justice has a way of catching up." And it did. Because Karen's meltdown had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Filing false reports was one thing. Harassing a federal agent was another. But publicly accusing her of federal overreach, that wasn't just HOA nonsense. That was slander broadcast in front of half the neighborhood, recorded on a dozen phones. By the end of the week, the board scrambled to contain the fallout. Karen's memo was quietly retracted, her flyers vanished from mailboxes, and her censure dissolved into thin air. But Karen herself, she wasn't ready to surrender her crown. She stomped up to our porch one final time, eyes wild, voice trembling with rage. "This is my neighborhood," she hissed. "I built this, and I will not let you ruin it." I looked her dead in the eye and said, "Karen, the only thing you've built is a reputation, and it's collapsing faster than my shed walls in a hurricane." My wife stepped beside me, her voice low but sharp. "This is your last warning. Stop, or the next step won't be HOA letters. It'll be federal charges." Karen froze, trembling clipboard shaking in her grip. For the first time, I saw something new in her eyes, fear. And without another word, she turned and walked away. The neighborhood had witnessed the meltdown of their self-appointed queen. Her empire of intimidation had crumbled not with a bang, but with a whimper and a squeal of SUV tires. And though the battle seemed over, the aftermath was still to come. Because once the dust settled, the real question remained: what happens to a Karen when her clipboard loses all its power? After Karen's final meltdown on our porch, the neighborhood shifted. You could feel it in the air, lighter, freer, like everyone had been holding their breath for months and could finally exhale. For the first time since we moved in, people began approaching us openly. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact in fear of Karen's wrath now waved, smiled, even struck up conversations. Some came over to apologize for staying silent during her reign of clipboard terror. "Sorry we didn't step in sooner," Mr. Caldwell admitted one evening. "She just made everyone's life miserable. Nobody wanted to be her next target." I shrugged. "We get it. Fear's a powerful thing. But she's not so scary anymore, is she?" He chuckled. "Nope. Not after the sheriff saluted your wife." The HOA board, desperate to clean up the mess, called an emergency meeting. Word spread quickly. But instead of their usual cozy little gathering in the clubhouse, half the neighborhood showed up. People came armed with videos, flyers Karen had shoved at them, even screenshots of her frantic texts. Karen sat at the head of the table, still clutching her clipboard, though her hands trembled as the evidence piled against her. "President Morgan," one neighbor began sharply, "why did you tell us the Taylors were violating rules when their property isn't in the HOA?" Karen stammered. I acted in the best interest of property values." "Best interest," another neighbor interrupted. "You called the cops. You dragged a federal agent into this nonsense." The room buzzed with outrage. For once, Karen didn't control the crowd. She shrank into her chair, eyes darting wildly for backup that wasn't there. By the end of the meeting, she was relieved of her duties as HOA president, which, in plain English, meant she was booted off her throne. Back at our house, life settled into something almost shocking peace. I finished building my workshop. Every nail I hammered felt like victory. Every board I set in place was a reminder that freedom doesn't come from clipboards or bylaws, it comes from standing your ground. Neighbors dropped by to admire the shed, ask for help with small repairs, or just share a beer. The same people who had once whispered behind closed blinds now laughed openly, trading Karen's stories like campfire legends. "She measured my lawn at night," once one neighbor confessed, shaking his head, "said my grass was a fire hazard." "She wrote me up for wind chimes," another added, claimed they weren't on the approved aesthetic list. We laughed together, and for the first time the neighborhood felt like a community, not a dictatorship. Karen, meanwhile, became a ghost. She still lived on the block, but her presence was muted. No more marches with a clipboard, no more pounding on doors, no more megaphones in the cul-de-sac. She avoided eye contact, ducked behind hedges, and left her SUV parked quietly in her driveway. It was almost sad in a way. Almost. One afternoon, as my wife and I sat on the porch enjoying the breeze, Karen passed by walking her tiny dog. She slowed, her eyes flicking toward us. For a second, I thought she might say something, but then her gaze dropped, and she hurried along without a word. My wife didn't gloat. She didn't even smile. She just sipped her tea and said softly, "Some lessons are learned the hard way." Weeks later, the sheriff stopped by one last time. He shook my hand, saluted my wife again, and said, "Glad things have quieted down here. If you need anything, don't hesitate to call." "Appreciate it," I said, "though hopefully the only calls we'll make will be about barbecues and block parties." The sheriff chuckled, tipped his hat, and left. As his SUV disappeared down the road, I realized something: we hadn't just survived Karen's campaign, we'd broken it. And in doing so, we'd reminded the whole neighborhood that bullies, no matter how loud, how insistent, or how official they look with a clipboard, fall apart when faced with truth and backbone. And all it took was a shed, a federal agent, and a sheriff's salute. If there's one thing I hope you take away from this story, it's this: bullies thrive on silence. They count on intimidation, on your fear, on your willingness to look the other way. And the longer you stay quiet, the stronger they get. But the moment you stand your ground, calmly and firmly, everything changes. Karen didn't lose her power because we yelled louder or fought dirtier. She lost because we refused to bend, because we documented everything, because we trusted the truth to do what it always does: shine through. My wife taught me that. She never raised her voice. She never lost her composure. She simply stayed steady, one step at a time, until Karen's empire collapsed under its own weight. And isn't that true in life too? Whether it's a toxic neighbor, a manipulative boss, or anyone who tries to bully their way through the world, standing firm with patience and integrity is the most powerful response. So here's my challenge to you. Have you ever faced a Karen in your life? Someone who tried to push you around, control you, or scare you into submission? Share your story in the comments. I want to hear it. And if you enjoyed this ride, hit subscribe, because trust me, there are more HOA nightmares, more twists, and more satisfying endings waiting for you. Until then, remember, stand tall, stay calm, and never underestimate the power of a good shed.